Earlier today, two West Virginia National Guardsmen were brazenly shot in Washington, D.C.
This heinous assault was an act of evil, an act of hatred, and an act of terror. It was a crime against our entire nation. It was a crime against humanity. The hearts of all Americans tonight are with those two members of the West Virginia National Guard and their families. I am determined to ensure that the animal who perpetrated this atrocity pays the steepest possible price.
As you hear about a shooting unfolding just steps away from the White House, it almost feels unreal, like something that belongs in a political thriller, not in the center of the most heavily guarded city in America. But tonight, this is the reality facing Washington, D.C. A sudden eruption of gunfire shattered the controlled calm around Farragut West, a place usually filled with office workers, tourists, and the steady rhythm of the metro system. Instead of the usual rush of commuters, the sound that dominated the air was panic, screams, footsteps, the razor-sharp echo of rounds fired in close quarters, and the immediate rush of officers sprinting toward danger. This was not a random incident. It wasn't a chaotic misunderstanding. Authorities say it was a targeted ambush, executed with chilling precision against two members of the National Guard, who were simply standing at their post. For months, the presence of National Guard patrols has been part of the everyday landscape of Washington. Residents have grown accustomed to seeing them on street corners, outside government buildings, near transportation hubs, and even blending in with the morning and evening crowds. Many treated it as background noise, another sign of a political era marked by tension, protests, and heightened security. But on this particular day, that familiar presence became the focal point of a sudden and violent attack. Witnesses describe a brief moment of confusion, followed by sheer terror, as a man raised a firearm, stepped forward, and opened fire without warning. The shots came so fast that some people initially thought they were hearing construction noise or a train braking on the tracks, until they saw the soldiers fall. Within seconds, the entire block transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Police vehicles screeched to a stop. Officers drew their weapons and pushed people away from the area. The metro station was shut down instantly as crowds poured out in panic, desperate to escape what they believed might be the beginning of something far bigger. Sirens seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the tight streets around the station. Helicopters swept overhead, and federal officers raced toward the scene, weaving through traffic and pedestrians frozen in shock. For many in D.C., it felt like a nightmare they had always feared could happen, but hoped never would. The victims were quickly identified as two members of the West Virginia National Guard, both stationed near the entrance as part of a security detail. Both were hit before they had any chance to respond. Early reports were filled with confusion, conflicting claims, and frantic speculation. Some outlets even stating that one soldier had died before clearer information was released. As the dust settled, officials confirmed that both were alive but in critical condition, fighting for their lives as the city held its breath. Medical teams worked urgently, rushing them from the scene to nearby trauma centers equipped for major emergencies. Their families were notified. Their fellow guardsmen were told to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The suspect, a 29-year-old Afghan national, was subdued after a brief exchange of fire, wounded, and taken into custody. That detail alone sent waves of discourse through social media, political circles, and everyday conversations. Some people immediately questioned how close he came to the White House. Others asked how he acquired a weapon. Many wondered how he blended into the crowd so quietly before launching his attack. And beneath all those questions was an uncomfortable truth. Even in an area saturated with security, no city is immune to sudden violence. Police quickly expanded the perimeter, pushing media back as investigators searched the area for shell casings, weapons, and signs of preparation. The air smelled of metal, dust, and adrenaline. Officers spoke in clipped, serious tones as they tried to ensure there were no additional threats. Commuters trapped behind barricades watched anxiously, texting loved ones, checking the news, refreshing updates every few seconds. Some cried, others just stared, numb, unable to process how quickly an ordinary day had turned into a national headline. Yet, through the chaos and uncertainty, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another shooting. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was an attack carried out in the heart of the nation's capital, within walking distance of the most powerful office in the world. And the shock waves from this moment would not fade quickly. In the hours after the attack, Washington, D.C. transformed into a city holding its breath. Streets that normally buzz with the sharp tempo of political life were suddenly quieter, heavier, coated with a kind of tension that settled into every corner. People stepped outside their offices and homes, not just to see what had happened, but to feel out whether the city itself had changed. Even though officials moved fast to contain the scene, a ripple of unease spread far beyond downtown. This was not an event confined to a single block. It was something that gripped an entire population, drawing them into a shared moment of fear, anger, and disbelief. Inside the metro tunnels, passengers stranded by the sudden shutdown stood together in clusters, refreshing their phones again and again, desperate for information. Some spoke in hushed conversations, trying to guess whether the incident was an isolated act or something more organized. Others simply stared at the closed station gates, remembering how many times they had passed through that very entrance without ever imagining it could become a target. Nearby businesses locked their doors early, employees forming small groups as they stepped outside, eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. Even the usual noise of the streets, horns, conversations, distant construction, seemed to dim under the weight of uncertainty. As news outlets began pushing out updates, more details about the attack's timing and execution came into focus. Witnesses described seeing the suspect hours before the shooting, blending into pedestrian crowds without raising suspicion. He moved with an ease that, in hindsight, unsettled many who saw him. Some thought he looked lost. Others assumed he was just another commuter. No one expected that he was carrying a loaded weapon and waiting for a moment when the guards were briefly distracted. It wasn't the kind of premeditation that involved elaborate planning or military-grade tactics. It was the simplicity of it, the quiet approach, the steady aim, the sudden eruption that made the attack even more frightening. By mid-afternoon, public officials began issuing statements, each one more urgent than the last. Mayors' offices, federal agencies, and security departments urged residents to stay calm but alert, a phrase that always signals that authorities are still piecing together what comes next. Every update emphasized that the suspect was in custody. Every message reassured people that no other attackers were believed to be involved. But reassurance is hard to accept on a day when the unthinkable has already happened. Many residents found themselves checking doors twice, avoiding crowded places, or choosing not to take the metro home at all. Meanwhile, the area around the White House shifted into an even higher state of security. Vehicles were diverted. Foot traffic tightened. Barricades expanded. Officers on patrol stood with a rigidity that made it clear they were not taking any chances. Tourists who had planned to visit iconic landmarks found themselves blocked by multiple layers of security they didn't fully understand. Some were frustrated, but most quietly accepted that the city was operating in emergency mode. The sense of vulnerability stretched far beyond the crime scene. Within law enforcement circles, urgency turned into a steady rhythm of hard, technical work. Agents combed through surveillance footage, tracing the suspect's movements from the moment he entered the area. Analysts examined digital records, travel logs, communication patterns, and any potential ties that might offer clues about motive. The suspect's background quickly became a focal point, not just who he was, but how he came to be in the United States, what his life looked like before the attack, and whether anyone else had any knowledge of what he planned to do. While investigators worked behind closed doors, journalists filled the gaps with early reporting that spread across television screens and social media feeds. The narrative shifted by the hour, sometimes minute by minute. Clips of the scene replayed millions of times. Speculation surged faster than official updates could counter it. And for many Americans watching from across the country, the attack didn't feel like something happening far away. It felt like a sign, a warning, a moment that said the stability they relied on might be more fragile than they believed. And as night began to settle over the capital, the weight of what had happened only deepened, settling into conversations, thoughts, and the uneasy silence that comes when a city tries to understand the aftermath of violence.
As Washington moved deeper into the night, the political response to the shooting began unfolding with a force that matched the gravity of the moment. What had started as a sudden act of violence on a downtown street was now shaping into a national turning point, drawing reactions from every corner of the country. Inside government buildings, phones rang nonstop as advisors, officials, and security personnel scrambled to coordinate statements, assess risk levels, and prepare for the wave of scrutiny that was sure to follow. The sight of armed troops bleeding on a sidewalk just blocks from the seat of American power wasn't something that could be softened, spun, or minimized. It demanded an immediate answer, and leadership at the highest level wasted no time in giving one. President Donald J. Trump addressed the nation with a tone that carried both anger and cold determination. He described the attack as an act of evil, delivered with a clarity that left little room for debate. His words caught attention not just because of their intensity, but because of the speed at which they arrived. Within hours, he made it clear that the federal government would respond decisively, announcing the deployment of 500 additional National Guard troops to the capital. The decision was framed as necessary to restore safety and reinforce a city that, even with its heavy security presence, had just been shaken in a way many thought was impossible. The announcement sent shockwaves through political circles. Supporters praised the move, saying it showed strength, resolve, and an unwavering commitment to national security. Critics, however, warned that flooding the streets with even more military personnel risked deepening the climate of fear lingering across the city. Some argued that the increased presence could make Washington feel less like a democratic capital and more like a fortified zone, where citizens move under the watchful eyes of soldiers instead of peacefully through public spaces. But regardless of the debate, the order was executed swiftly. Convoys rolled into the city, soldiers took up positions near government buildings, and the visual landscape of Washington changed almost overnight. Inside the halls of Congress, the reaction mirrored the broader political divide. Lawmakers demanded answers about how the suspect entered the country, how he obtained a weapon, and whether intelligence agencies had missed any warning signs. Committees arranged emergency briefings. Security analysts appeared on televised panels, listing vulnerabilities and gaps that the attack had forced into the open. The discussion quickly expanded from the single suspect to larger issues that had been simmering for years: immigration procedures, refugee vetting, border policies, and the question of domestic threats evolving in unpredictable ways. Outside government buildings, the public response unfolded in real time across social media and in conversations happening in homes and cafes throughout the city. Some expressed grief and concern for the wounded soldiers, posting messages of support and solidarity with their families. Others reacted with anger, pointing fingers at political decisions made years before the attack. Many simply struggled to make sense of it all, overwhelmed by the speed at which an ordinary day had turned into a moment of national crisis. As the night pressed on, cable news networks aired panel discussions that lasted long past their scheduled programming. Analysts debated the implications of the attack, questioning whether Washington's increased military presence would stabilize the city or further inflame tensions. Commentators examined the suspect's background, trying to determine whether his actions were isolated or part of a larger, more troubling trend. Theories multiplied, and with each one, the atmosphere across the country grew more charged. But amid all the noise, there was a quieter, more human layer emerging. Outside the hospital where the wounded guardsmen were being treated, small groups of people gathered, waiting for updates. Some were family members, others were fellow service members who came in uniform, standing in silent rows under the harsh glow of hospital lights. They spoke little, their faces marked with worry and exhaustion. They didn't need the debates, the speculation, or the political arguments. They needed answers. They needed hope. In that moment, the national conversation narrowed down to something deeply personal, the life or death struggle of two men who had simply been doing their duty. Across the capital, people began posting messages about what the city meant to them, how they felt seeing their home turned into a crime scene, and why moments like this remind them of the fragility that exists even in places wrapped in layers of protection. Anyone walking the streets could feel the tension, but they could also feel a sense of unity slowly forming between strangers who shared the same fear, the same shock, and the same need to understand what would come next. And while officials worked late into the night, the city remained awake, alert, and aware that something fundamental had shifted in its atmosphere, something that couldn't be easily undone. As dawn approached, Washington emerged into a gray, muted morning that carried the weight of the previous day's violence. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the entire city had collectively paused to process the shock that had rippled through it. The early sunlight fell across metal barricades still lining the blocks near the shooting, casting long shadows over a scene that had not yet returned to normal. Even the air felt different, thicker, slower, as though it held onto the tension from the night before. People walked with deliberate steps, glancing toward the area where the attack took place, unable to shake the unease that had settled deeply into the capital. Reporters gathered once again at the edge of the police perimeter, their cameras pointed toward the cordoned-off street, ready for any new developments. Their voices, steady and practiced, carried a mix of urgency and exhaustion as they repeated every confirmed detail while avoiding the many unknowns still hanging over the investigation. Officers continued to move methodically, documenting evidence, mapping out trajectories, collecting anything that might reveal what had driven the gunman to take aim at two uniformed soldiers without hesitation. Crime scene tape fluttered in the cold breeze, and officials stood quietly behind it, watching over a street that had become a symbol of a deeper vulnerability. Inside the hospitals treating the wounded guardsmen, the atmosphere was tense and hopeful all at once. Doctors moved carefully through crowded hallways, speaking in low voices as they monitored the soldiers' conditions. Each hour brought new assessments, small signs of improvement, sudden concerns, and the steady rhythm of medical machines working to keep two men alive. Their families stayed close, some sitting silently in waiting rooms, others leaning on each other for strength as they tried to comprehend how a day that should have been routine had spiraled into a fight for survival. Messages of support from across the country began pouring in. Letters, phone calls, social media posts, each one a reminder that despite the political storms gathering outside, there was still a shared sense of humanity uniting people in moments like this. Meanwhile, at federal buildings across the city, officials gathered to confront the broader implications of the attack. Security experts reviewed protocols, questioning whether the measures in place were enough or whether the city needed a complete rethinking of how it protects itself. Members of Congress held early morning briefings, pressing intelligence leaders for clarity about any warning signs that might have been missed. Discussions swelled into arguments at times, as different sides of the political spectrum clashed over what the attack revealed about national security, immigration policy, and the complex balance between freedom and protection. But beneath all the heated debate was a shared realization that the shooting had exposed gaps in the system that could no longer be ignored. On the streets, the newly deployed National Guard troops took their positions across the capital. Their presence was impossible to miss, a visible reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Some residents viewed them as reassuring, a sign that the city was doing everything in its power to prevent further violence. Others felt unsettled, worried that the growing military footprint could shift the city's identity, making it feel less like an open, democratic space and more like a fortified zone. Either way, the troops carried themselves with quiet focus, aware of the fragility surrounding the city and the immense responsibility placed on their shoulders. As updates continued to emerge throughout the morning, residents across the country tuned in, trying to make sense of what the attack meant moving forward. For many, it wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the broader question of how such violence could penetrate a place long considered impenetrable. People wondered whether the incident marked a shift in the nation's security landscape, whether it hinted at new threats, or whether it reflected deeper tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Conversations in households, workplaces, and online communities centered not only on fear, but on frustration, resilience, and the desire for stability in a time when stability feels increasingly elusive. By midday, Washington was beginning to regain its rhythm. Offices reopened. The metro system resumed limited service. People returned to their routines, but with an awareness that hung heavy over every movement. The memory of the shooting lingered in the background, shaping silent thoughts and quiet observations. It was clear that the attack had left a mark not just on the victims and their families, but on the city as a whole, challenging assumptions about safety, testing the limits of preparedness, and reminding everyone that even the most protected spaces are not immune to sudden acts of violence. Yet despite the uncertainty, there was also a renewed sense of resolve weaving through the capital, a determination to understand, to adapt, to push forward, and to stay vigilant. Washington had been shaken, but it was not standing still. A city shaped by history and resilience was already beginning to gather itself, ready to face whatever came next with the same steadiness that has carried it through every moment of upheaval before.